Slow down, you move too fast. You got to make the morning last. Just kicking down the cobblestones, looking for fun and feeling groovy. Feeling groovy. Feeling groovy. Hello lamppost, what you knowin'? I come to watch your flowers growing. Ain't you got no rhymes for me? Do it and do-do, feeling groovy. Feeling groovy. Feeling groovy. Feeling groovy. I got no deeds to do, no promises to keep. I'm dappled and drowsy and ready to sleep. Let the morning time drop all its petals on me. Life, I love you, all is groovy. Slow down, you move too fast. You got to make the morning last.
Thank you, Sharon. Sharon is one of the daughters of Cleon and Jewel Skousen, and came all the way from Seattle, more or less, and drove down for this occasion, which we really appreciate. We thank you all for coming. The reason we thought this would be a really nice occasion for this fireside, I guess it's been about 17 years since my uncle Cleon Skousen passed away, and we had his funeral, and the funeral was, well, it took up 2 church buildings, and they had closed circuit broadcast, and Senator Orrin Hatch was one of the speakers, and President Thomas Monson, and other general authorities. So it was really quite an occasion, because Cleon Skousen had an impact. And he wasn't a general authority. He was never even a bishop. But he was a man of tremendous influence. And in his story, which my wife and I have compiled into a book called There Were Giants in the Land, I came up with this title because the 20th century is special. There were some incredible individuals, if you look back, who were giants in the land, both for good and evil in many cases. So anyway, as I go around the world, I'm an investment newsletter writer and financial economist, and I give speeches. Nowhere near the number of speeches Cleon Skousen gave in his lifetime. It is estimated he gave 10,000 talks in his lifetime. But even after 17 years, as I go around giving talks, people come up to me and say, "Are you related to Cleon Skousen?" Because of the impact he had in their lives. And I thought this statement that we had at the beginning of the book from Professor Dan Peterson from BYU, he said, "It is difficult to overstate how big a name W. Cleon Skousen was when I was growing up in Southern California in the 1960s and for years thereafter. His books were widely read, and his views on religious history and doctrine, to say nothing of political issues, seemed to carry considerable weight for many members of my ward and stake and well beyond." And he goes on to say that Cleon Skousen was a consequential lay Latter-day Saint of the 20th century, an author whose influence continues to echo into the 21st. And So what we'd like to do tonight, first of all, I've asked my wife Joanne, who is really the chief person responsible for putting together this compilation. My uncle, he probably, I think there were like 120 journals, isn't that right, Paul? That he put together, and all handwritten, and over time we were able to transcribe those. Rick was able to do it, and others who were all involved in this, all of the members of his family. And putting this together, this is really a labor of love that took us 3 years to put together, even with the help of the work that had already been done. So Joanne did a really fantastic job for those who have read the book, putting that together and creating this image of a great righteous crusader in the latter days. And so we've asked her to give the first talk, and then afterwards I'm going to make a few remarks, and then I'll introduce Senator Mike Lee, who Cleon Skousen was in many ways a mentor of his, and he'll speak to that at that point. And afterwards, he would be glad to take your questions. So I think that'll be a wonderful evening. And then we've asked Jamie Skousen, my younger brother, to offer the closing prayer. So with that, let's turn the time over to my wife, Joanne.
Well, thank you all for being here, and it's just wonderful to see so many of you here and to reminisce with you. I was asked to talk about the process of writing this book, and I'm looking forward to doing that. I wanted to start, though, by just acknowledging some of the people who really helped us with this that we couldn't have done without. And first, I would say Cleon's oldest son, Eric, who transcribed those 140 volumes of handwritten journals, and he spent years transcribing those and digitizing them, and so that we didn't have to do that. We didn't have to type it. We were able to use what he had done. Rick and David Skousen, his two oldest sons, also gave us access to all of the letters that he wrote to them while they were on their missions during a very crucial time in Cleon's life, and where he only had time to maybe dash notes off in his journal, he wrote very detailed letters to his sons, and so we were able to use a lot of those. Chris Lewis, who was the former editor-in-chief of the Latter-day Sentinel, started to write Cleon's biography in the 90s, and he interviewed him for months and went through a lot of the journals. And because of that, we have access to these interviews where Cleon not only talked about what happened that day, but he reminisced with Cleon, and that's where we get a lot of the background for the book that he didn't write in his journals, but he shared with Chris as he was giving background to the stories. And then Harold's daughters were instrumental in transcribing those interviews, again, so that we could use them without having to type them. And then Cleon's son Harold, he was really the pusher, the mover behind this. He encouraged us every step of the way. He helped gather all the pictures. He answered so many questions that I had that I couldn't ask Cleon, of course, and Harold was able to either answer them or find the answers to them. Mark's sister Bonnie wrote a wonderful background on the Freeman Institute that was so essential, but Cleon hadn't written it, but she was there. She was there when the Freeman Institute started, and so we appreciate that. And of course, the entire family contributed to the work Cleon accomplished. And I'd like to share with you something that Cleon wrote in his journal about his family. He said, I told Jewel we owed a lot to our children. It was Harold who went around taping these talks, and Glenn who insisted that 26 of them be put into an album for general distribution. Meanwhile, Rick took scads of precious pictures we would otherwise never have had, and Julianne and Sharon typed up the manuscripts for at least a dozen of my books while Julie proofread them. David had been a resource man and called numerous books to my attention. He also selected the outstanding collection of pictures that appeared in The Making of America. David is also one of the speediest typists in the family and typed a lot of my early manuscripts. Paul turned out to be another writer, and Brent was our treasurer and accountant on whom the whole family relied when it came to money and the family trust. What a great family, he concluded, and great was in capital letters. He loved his family, and while he was always busy, that was what kept him centered, and that comes out very much in his journals and in the book. Well, many people attempted to write this biography, but it was just so daunting. He had such a life, and he writes about that in the journal, and it's in this book. Mark and I both had given it a stab in the early 90s as well, but it was just so daunting until Mark and I wrote the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And the way we did it was Yale University gave us access to the unpublished letters and journals of Benjamin Franklin, and Mark went through everything and culled the most important stories, and then I went through and rearranged them so that we edited his autobiography completely in his words, just by rearranging what he had written. And then suddenly we realized that was how we could write the autobiography of W. Cleon Skousen, just by rearranging his journal entries to create a narrative story. Now, Cleon was a master storyteller, as you all know, and I didn't want it to read just like a collection of journal entries, and I didn't want it to read like an academic tome. We did need to make a few basic adjustments, such as changing verb tenses or pronouns occasionally if it needed to be third person instead of first person. We had to add surnames and some identifying details when he mentioned people just by first name in his journals. And then I created a few transitional sentences to make the narrative flow smoothly. So when you see a phrase such as a few years later, or that would all happen in the future, or in the beginning, that's me using a transitional phrase instead of the journal date. But other than that, the book is written entirely in Cleon's words, or as in with Bonnie's case, the words of someone who was there, and we quote those as well. I also didn't want to use brackets and ellipses and interior citations the way we did in the Franklin book, because although it was very academic, it became so distracting and disrupted the flow of the reader as they were reading through it. So instead, I just included a note in the preface in the introduction about our process, which I just went through with you, and we printed the book without those asterisks and brackets and citations and other interruptions, the way I believe Cleon would have done it if I had been editing his autobiography alongside him. And a nice thing is that with modern technology, we can maintain a digitized version of the original manuscript, so readers who want to find additional context or dates in the original document can do so simply by entering key phrases from this book into the original document, and boom, there it is, and you can see the dates and the context and so forth. So I think it worked really well to document it and at the same time make it a book that reads really smoothly. So I arranged the stories by topic, sometimes uniting 5 or 6 different entries across 3 or 4 different decades to create a complete story. It's still in his words, but it's not in chronicle order in which he wrote them. He spent a lot of time in his last decade reminiscing. Someone would call him, or he'd get a letter, or he'd read something, and it would jog his memory, and he would write about something that had happened 30 years before. And I have to say, the last third of his journal became really kind of tedious to read. But what I realized was that the tone and perspective of those later reminiscences worked perfectly as a concluding paragraph or two for the actual stories. So once I started moving those later reminiscences to where they actually happened in the book, suddenly the book started to really come alive. There we had the perspective, the context, the historical, what he learned from the experiences. And I think those reflections worked really well. And in the end, the last third of the book came about the last 10% of the book, and we lost all that tedium. So I was really pleased when we figured that out and got that done. So I'd like tonight to give you 4 examples of stories from the book and how we did it, and why I think it was important to do it that way, and why I think Cleon would be pleased. The first one is Aunt Jewel. Aunt Jewel was a gem. Her name was perfect. But shortly after their marriage, Cleon wrote a rather harsh journal entry about his wife that I'm sure he would not want published by itself. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to give you the context we had for it. He said, "Marriage was a challenge. Julie did not enjoy the chores of cooking, cleaning, getting ready, being on time, planning ahead, and facing up to the normal obligations of surviving in the helter-skelter, rushing tempo of modern life. I used to think she should have been born in some aristocratic mansion of the Victorian age with servants and valets. Nevertheless, we kept pushing ahead, and she supported me in all my endeavors, both personally and professionally. We deeply loved each other, and that helped. But it could have gone the other way. Not having meals on time, being late for church, and nearly every other engagement we tried to do together, having to constantly push for more pre-planning and preparation was a trial and a tribulation. Sometimes there were brief spats over it, as I found myself doing many household chores when I should have been studying law or preparing talks." Oh, Cleon. She was 17. She's wanted to be a wife, not a mother. He was young too, and he needed to learn. And I'm sure he would have been appalled if that letter was written just by itself, because that was not how he felt about his wonderful wife. So what happened was, I wanted to keep the entry because there's something, I think, illustrative to all of us about young love and early marriage and expectations and working things out and getting to the end, almost 75 years, and being so happy and so still in love, and they were. So I found 5 other entries related to Julie's growth as a wife, a partner, and an accomplished woman. 2 were written within the first 2 years of their marriage, and 2 were written much, much later. So I added the phrase in the beginning to this entry for transition to indicate that this is a story of change, of transformation, of growth. And this is how the section ended up. So it starts with, "It was unusual to marry at 17, and Julie's youthfulness caused a few shockwaves in the community, especially when I brought her back to Washington. Most of the Washington wives and their husbands had been to college already. Jule wasn't very comfortable and wasn't received very well by these gals in the Washington ward. It was a big congregation of 700 people coming in for government jobs, comprising 200 returned missionaries and many young married couples. Jule knew immediately that she was not being accepted, and it took a while to get over that. Finally, when some of the women really got to know her, they passed the word about what a kind, intelligent, and fun-loving girl she was, but it was very difficult and heartbreaking for her at first. To see how that compassion he felt for her buffers the other one that comes after that. And we see that this was just a couple who were in love and were making it through the transitions. Then this is what I added after that. I found this also in his journal, but I knew I had an angel in the making, and I knew she was putting up with a lot of Skousen gusto in me, so we struggled along together. Now, isn't that a nice conclusion to that kind of harsh? And here's what else I found. Then I began to gradually notice something. Julie began writing little notes to herself. She began making little lists of things she had to do and carefully checked off each of the unpleasant chores or items of preparation that had to be finished, such as having the ingredients for a good meal or the clothes and other needs for a trip. Through the years, things got better and better. Jule became an excellent manager of our household accounts. At one time, most wives did not know anything about their financial affairs of the family, which caused serious problems if the husband predeceased her. I therefore trained Jule to handle our affairs, which she did very well. In fact, it wasn't until she began to have some health issues well after our golden anniversary that I had to take over the accounts and checked our balances with the savings and loan. She never did learn to like household work, so I especially appreciated her love and loyalty, which drove her to continue the grind until our home became an orderly haven of love, cleanliness, good meals, and happy living. Soon she became famous for all those things. She was an angel on earth. So I'm really pleased with how that worked. It took 5 or 6 different entries over the course of well past their golden anniversary, but it worked. Now, Cleon was super busy all the time, and he was often juggling full-time jobs, church assignments, writing books, giving speeches. Mark said that ours took 3 years. It took him 14 years to write Days of the Living Christ, so ours was, just done in a snap. And that didn't leave any time for just hanging around the house, and he often felt the pinch. One Christmas day while they were living in California, he wrote this: "I spent most of the day with the boys building a replica of the Golden Gate and Oakland Bay bridges with erector sets. We then built trellises connecting them and ran the electric train on top of them. It was quite an engineering achievement for a lawyer. David said, 'Daddy, this is the first time you've ever built anything for us.' I wondered if the rabbit pens, teeter-totters, airplanes, and games were all a wasted effort." You could tell he was a little hurt by that comment, but David was just a little boy. And then I like how he adds to that. I want to make sure, this is where it is. There was some truth to what he said. If I have one regret during those chaotic and productive times, it was the time I did not spend with my young family. In later years, my son Rick expressed his disappointment at how little time I spent at home with them, playing or just visiting. And this is what I wrote to him. And I think this is just very deep and rich and poignant. "Dear Rick, I too have wished that we could spend more time together in council and just visiting, but circumstances have prevented it. This does not mean we can't make up for it in the future. Every time you read the first 2,000 years of The Naked Communist, you will know that those books would have never been written if it hadn't been for the love and support of my wonderful wife and children. Writing these books was a mission of sorts, and it separated us more than any of us would have liked. Nevertheless, none of us would have wanted it differently, I'm sure, especially if differently had meant failing to get the job done. I think our Heavenly Father sends us to the earth knowing exactly what circumstances will crowd in around us, and He therefore sends us together in family teams so that we will all pull through together. That is the way I feel about you. The Lord knew you would resent the preoccupation of your father with his assigned task, but He also knew you could take it. Others would have been bitter. This blessing will return to you. Being what you are, you too will need children who will be patient with the Father who keeps many fires successfully burning. And because you supported your father, your children will be the special kind who will support you. This is the blessing you have earned." What a father. What a man. He also loved being around his grandchildren. There were so many little entries that he wrote about when the grandchildren would come to visit, or he would go to visit them, and he just loved being with them and spending as much time as he could. I want to read just two really quick passages, if I can find them really fast, and if not, I'll skip them. Okay, Christmas days were quite different after our grandchildren were coming along wonderfully well. They were a beautiful crowd of happy, intelligent human beings, and we were very proud of them. Some of them were becoming excellent musicians, some were artists, and nearly all of them were doing very well academically. With around 40 people in the house, it was amazing how contented and congenial everyone was. Everyone seemed to have a great time, and there was no bickering or quarreling among the children. It was a beautiful day and long to be remembered. And then this one toward the very end of their lives, when he said, "An hour later, I checked through the house and found 2 children in the garden room, 3 playing with the games in the world room, 2 playing air hockey, and Joey trying to beat a Nintendo video game on my TV. Meanwhile, little Josh and Marianne were experimenting on the organ. It was just great to see all these little personalities finding their own favorite entertainment at Grandma and Grandpa's house." So I hope that brings back some nice memories to those of you who aren't so little anymore. Well, Cleon met many famous people in his lifetime, and he wrote about them whenever they met. Some included Ezra Taft Benson, David O. McKay, Joseph Fielding Smith, and many other church leaders. In the political world, he met frequently with Senator Orrin Hatch, Congressman Ron Paul, Ronald Reagan, and many others. And he met numerous Hollywood celebrities, including Olivia de Havilland, John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Cecil B. DeMille, Roy Rogers, Rosemary Reed, and Roy Rogers, by the way, he went fishing with Harold and Cleon at Strawberry Reservoir, and Harold was really kind of excited about that. People came in and out of his office and his home unexpectedly, and he was always made time for them. One of those was Eldridge Cleaver. Now, you might be surprised to know that Eldridge Cleaver and Cleon were very close friends. You might be even more surprised to know that Eldridge Cleaver joined the church. For this story, I required a lot more work to tease it out than just going through the journals. In this case, I used 4 different kinds of resources for this story. Cleon's journal entries, whenever they met, interviews with Chris Lewis, which provided lots of history and background, Cleon's journal entry, The internet, which helped me sort out the truth and accuracy of things, and then oral reports from people who were there and had heard him tell his stories. Eldridge Cleaver became an enthusiastic member of the Freeman Institute. He did advertisements for them. He spoke there. Their relationship continued for many years. He was very famous for saying he would rather spend his entire life in jail, in an American jail, than be free in any other country in the world. He really did change after he left the Black Panthers. And I just want to read one statement in that whole section. It covers about 6 pages, but this is what he said about Eldridge Cleaver at the very end. He said, and Cleaver went up and down. He joined the church. He had good experiences. He had bad experiences. In the end, he had left the church, and he had gotten into some serious problems, and the end of his life was not very happy. Many years later, Glenn Kimber and I talked about Eldridge Cleaver and the tragic results of his going to California to run for Congress instead of staying in Utah and writing his autobiography. Glenn said Eldridge told him I was the only father he really ever had, and that he should have stayed in Salt Lake. He died of cancer in 1998. So Cleon was like a father figure to Eldridge Cleaver. So we went through 24 revisions of this book, 24. And every time we changed it, our book designer, Ned Piplovich, would have to reformat the entire book because of the pictures. He would have to wrap the text. You're nodding. You know exactly what I mean. 24 times. Well, we thought we were finished at revision 23. I was simply going through it one last time for typos when I came once again to 2 particular stories at the end of the book that had continued to nag at me every time I went through it, and I would always say, oh, it's okay. One was the story of discovering the Dan Ludlow file, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, and the other was Cleon's hurt feelings about being left out of Ted Callister's book, Believing Christ. It was one of the very few times in 140 volumes that he expressed his hurt feelings. Both stories needed to be included in the book, but the stories were isolated and didn't have the tone and spirit that Uncle Cleon would have given them if he were preparing them himself for publication. I knew I had to give them context while using Cleon's own words. So here's what I did. I decided to move half of the Ludlow journal entry to our chapter covering the 1970s when he was teaching at BYU and the situation actually happened. In fact, I united 4 separate entries from 3 different decades to create this section in this book. It's the section that explains the question that many people have had, which is, why weren't Cleon's books cited in church manuals? And Cleon had wondered that himself. You might have wondered that. And he wrote from time to time about the why, but he didn't have the answer until this happened. He said, long after my retirement, I was sorting through papers that had accumulated through the years and came across some real treasures, including the files of Tom Truitt, who had worked in the church history department. The files solved the mystery of why my books weren't being quoted in church manuals. Now, he didn't come across this until the late 90s. All those years, he'd had those hurt feelings. And here's what happened. The file contained a negative review of the first 2,000 years written by Daniel H. Ludlow when he was chairman of the Correlation Committee. Also in that folder, I found a file marked W. Cleon Skousen. In it was a memorandum asking the Correlation Committee why they didn't allow any of Brother Skousen's books to be quoted in church manuals. Apparently, it was on the orders of Joseph Fielding Smith, with whom I'd been very close for many years, and then he goes into some explanations about differences of opinion between Joseph Fielding Smith and Elder Widtsoe, who had been Cleon's mentor. And he says, in this dispute, I knew Elder Widtsoe was right, but Elder Smith outlived Elder Widtsoe. And so that happened. So that was the explanation. But then here's what else I put with this. By contrast, in 1994, I received a nice letter from Elder Jeffrey Holland on the Council of the 12 expressing appreciation for the 2 volumes of the Days of Living Christ. He'd been president of BYU when I was teaching there and was also a distant cousin. And he talks about how Jeffrey Holland had praised his books and appreciated it. And then he got a letter from Vaughn J. Featherstone of the Council of the 70, who had similar praise for the Isaiah book. And Elder Featherstone said, "You have always been one of my favorite writers of all those who have written for the church and about the gospel plan. I think you are the foremost authority in the church, including general authorities regarding the Old and New Testaments. I have loved your book, Isaiah Speaks in Modern Times. What a classic study. The Making of America was marvelous, and I'm going back and rereading the first 2,000 years, the 3,000 years, the 4,000 years." And then he goes on a lot more, and he finally says, "I love the way you write. I love your thinking, and I appreciate you more than words can express. Thanks for the 2 great volumes on Days of the Living Christ," yada, yada. And then Cleon says, "This wonderful letter was almost overwhelming and extremely encouraging at a time when I sorely needed it." And then the postscript, which only happened just before Cleon died. "Happily, the resistance to my book was eventually lifted, and in 2003, the official lessons for the Old Testament that were presented on the internet contained references from my 1,000 Years series." So now we had the whole story of what happened and the balancing of other people who really loved his books, and then in the end, his books weren't banned after all. They never were banned, they just weren't used in the church manuals. Well, the other part of the story was just as important, and I'm going to end with this. Cleon was a giant of a man, and he made enemies as well as friends. As a Wise Relief Society president once told me, "The only people who never offend anyone are the people who never accomplish anything." And to John Munanga, that was Linda Pravat. And Cleon accomplished a lot. And so he did have people who resented him or were jealous of him or disliked him for various reasons. But he was an optimistic soul who never let himself stay down in the dumps, and he tried to see the best in everyone. That's why there isn't a lot of controversy or criticism in this book. He didn't write much in his journal of criticism or controversy. He was a positive, upbeat person. Nevertheless, the decision by Dan Ludlow to reject Cleon's work in official church manuals hurt a lot, and it continued to gnaw at him. So I moved the part about the correlation committee to the chapter on teaching at BYU, but I kept the second part of the entry about the Ludlow files in the chapter Final Years, and where it belongs, with a chance meeting with Dan Ludlow at the funeral of Myrtle White, Cleon's son David's mother-in-law. And this is what he wrote, and this is what I want to end with. He said, "I've always marveled at the healing power of the Spirit. When my son David's mother-in-law, Myrtle White, died, the funeral was held in the chapel where David and his family worshiped. Judy was Myrtle's only child, and she wrote a lovely tribute to her mother. David gave the family prayer and dedicated the grave. I was asked to give the closing prayer. David Gardner, a close friend of the family, sang Danny Boy as beautifully as I've ever heard it sung. David then played his own composition dedicated to Myrtle and read an original poem addressed to her." Now here's the hard part. Dr. Daniel H. Ludlow, who had been instrumental in converting Judy and her parents to the gospel, gave the main address. This presented a bit of a challenge for me. Here's where I put that other half of the file entry. Dan Ludlow had written a very superficial review of the first 2,000 years as chairman of the Correlation Committee many years earlier, and the changes he suggested were either erroneous or insignificant. While I was at BYU, Dan Ludlow seemed determined to limit my influence on the campus and did not invite me to participate in any part of the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, which he edited. When I left BYU, Dan seemed greatly relieved and instructed the religion faculty to eliminate. This is another journal entry. Then he talks about the Tad Callister book. I put that there, and his talking about a school of scholars. That all goes in there. That's where all of his hurt feelings are. Because there was a point in putting them all there. Because here's what happened next at the funeral. All of this was on my mind as I sat beside Dan Ludlow on the stand at Myrtle's funeral that day. When he rose to speak, he made no reference to me, even though I was sitting on the stand near him and we had been colleagues for many years, and I felt slighted. However, he gave the most spiritual funeral talk I had heard in recent years, and I was very moved by what he had to say. Therefore, in my closing prayer, I expressed appreciation for all we had heard, and especially for the profound and comforting thoughts of Brother Ludlow. Whatever his feelings might have been when he arrived and saw me at the funeral, the prayer seemed to have had a healing influence on him, as his talk had had on me. After the service, when I went to thank him for his excellent address, he put his arm around me as though we were the closest of friends. I was very happy for the tender mercies of the Spirit that can turn the bitter into sweet within the twinkling of an eye. Isn't that a beautiful story? How the Spirit can just change those harsh feelings to sweet feelings. That's the kind of man Cleon was. He was hurt, but when the Spirit told him it was okay, it was okay. Dan Ludlow was a brother, and we all fight with our brothers, don't we? And we all get over it. I think Cleon's message for us would be, press on, do good works, complete your mission, listen to the Spirit, and forgive others the way the Savior forgives you. I loved Uncle Cleon. He was such a wonderful man, and I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to spend these 3 years with him. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne. I think she really captured the struggles, not just the successes, but also the difficulties that we all face in life. And so we put together a book that's really a tell-all biography, autobiography. I mean, there's a lot in these private journals that we decided to leave in because the outcome was so positive, like the Dan Ludlow story. And there are many examples in this book about inspiring moments with Cleon, particularly about his first book, The Prophecy in Modern Times. This book came out because in 1939 at Stake Conference, that Ezra Taft Benson was the stake president at the time, and general authorities came in at these quarterly general conference or state conferences pretty regularly. In Washington, D.C., at the Washington, D.C. church building, which is a beautiful building, in early 1939, an apostle came forward, Richard R. Lyman, and he said to the audience of 1,000 people, and this is early 1939, right before the beginning of World War II, and he said, "Brothers and sisters, I've just returned from Europe, and I know that war is on your minds. And I just want to comfort you to know there will be no war." And in his private journal, Cleon wrote, "The Spirit was cold as ice." And then 6 months later, in the summer of 1939, Elder Melvin J. Ballard came to the same quarterly conference. And he said, "Brothers and sisters, I've just come back from Europe. And I want to tell you something. I hate war. War is the worst thing that can happen to us. But I am sorry to say that there will be war. And you, as members of the church, better be prepared for it." And Cleon wrote in his journal, the Spirit was stronger than he'd ever felt. And of course, war did come. That was Melvin J. Ballard's last lecture, last talk as a general authority. He died of cancer a month later. And so a couple years later, Elder Richard R. Lyman was excommunicated for adultery. So the Spirit it's important to confirm your own spiritual experience when you listen to church leaders and get that confirmation of the Spirit that is so important. Well, tonight I'm just delighted to have as our final speaker Senator Mike Lee. And Mike Lee, I've known for a number of years. He's spoken at our Freedom Fest conference in Las Vegas on a number of occasions. And one of the things that Cleon was a real strong believer in, and one that I think touched the heart of Mike Lee, and one of the reasons he decided to run for senator in 2010, was because we've all read in Section 98 of the Doctrine and Covenants and Section 101 that our Constitution is inspired. And in fact, it even says anything that comes more or less of this cometh of evil, referring to the Constitution. So the Constitution isn't anarchy, and it's not totalitarian, it's limited government. That is the secret to the success of the Constitution and why it's inspired. And while we had President Dallin Oaks just 2 years ago in General Conference give a wonderful talk on the Constitution. And Cleon was very much a believer in that, as well as the influence of the Book of Mormon in America being a land of promise, in the secret combinations in the last days. These affected Cleon's writings and his influence. And so I would like to now ask Senator Mike Lee to come forward and give us his thoughts about Cleon and the topic we've given him: who will save the inspired Constitution of the United States? Brother Lee.
It's an intimidating assignment to be asked to speak about truly a giant who I've come to learn more about and love even more in the last few weeks since Mark sent me a copy of There Were Giants in the Land. It's even more intimidating when, while reading that book, in anticipation of delivering remarks honoring that giant, I learned that throughout my entire life I've been mispronouncing his name badly. In the opening pages of the book, it talks about the fact that his mother had always called him Cleon. And I thought, well, that's really strange. I'm glad that didn't take. Turns out they still call him that. All of them do. So please forgive me if I lapse into the other direction. I'm someone for whom old habits die hard. When I go and visit members of my ward whom I've been assigned to minister, I describe it as home teaching. I still refer to the artist formerly known as Prince, and these habits die hard. I first met Cleon Skousen the day I was married in the Salt Lake Temple. It's either just before or just after the ceremony was performed. The day is something of a blur when you try to recollect the day you were married 30 years ago. He came up and introduced himself to me, and I was honored beyond my ability to express to him at the time or to you now that he would be at my wedding. I had no idea at the time that he and my wife's family had gone back many decades. My wife's grandmother was a designer mentioned in the book named Rosemary Reed. She designed bathing suits. And she had been raised in the colonies up in Canada, and so they had some of that in common. And so we had maintained a close friendship with the family ever since then. That's not where the connections with my family end, of course. I learned, I think first from my father, but certainly also in reading the book, that he was my late father's debate coach in BYU. And in that respect, I have many things to thank him for, because my dad taught me to debate. He taught me to debate when I was in high school debate. He taught me how to present arguments in court. And I know he drew on what he learned from Cleon Skousen in that effort. So I will begin my speaking assignment, which Mark gave me, which was, who will save the inspired Constitution? By following the rule that my dad gave me as a young man that I'm sure he got from Cleon Skousen, which is, when you're asked a question in court or in a debate, you first give a short answer, a one-word answer if possible, a one-sentence answer if not possible, and then proceed to give the longer answer. The short answer to that question is, people like Cleon Skousen will be the ones who save our inspired Constitution, and the only ones who do it. Now, you may say to yourselves immediately, there is no one else like Cleon Skousen. And while true, that tells us something that we ought to remember. We tend to lionize a figure like this. I know I always have. I was awestruck. I've met a number of important people in my lifetime, but I don't think I've ever been more awestruck than when I met this man. And so we tend to lionize them. We tend to think of them as people who enjoyed one unbridled, unrestrained series of successes after the other. And he was that man, to be sure. But There Were Giants in the Land, we learned that like any mortal human being, he suffered challenges just like everybody else did. He struggled, he had doubts, he had times when he wasn't sure how things were going to turn out in his career, for his family, and otherwise, and he kept going. And so we have to remember that. So now to the longer answer. Look, there are many heirs to Cleon Skousen, not just his lineal descendants and his relatives, but people like me who only met him once, but who nonetheless benefited in countless ways from things that he taught. Things that he taught to my father, things that he taught me through books that he wrote, and countless others like him. And lots of other people who have never met him, who will never meet him in this lifetime, since he's been gone now for some 17 years or so, but who nonetheless benefit from the fact that he lived and he taught humanity certain things that he had acquired through his lifetime. And I hope that in our discussions tonight we can talk about what uniquely qualified him to impart that wisdom, to help us understand, revere, defend, and protect, ultimately to restore our Constitution. He acquired pieces of information in a wide variety of fields, and I'm going to discuss the first few of these in a very deliberate sequence, in the order in which I imagine he learned them, and certainly in the order in which it became necessary for him to be who he was. Someone who is a defender of the Constitution and who remains one of the greatest defenders of the Constitution ever to live on this planet. The first piece of knowledge that he acquired was of God. He knew who God was. He developed a testimony of God in his mission to Ireland. That was, of course, not the beginning of his testimony, but it was an early fulfillment of it, where he was given assignments far beyond what someone of his age could have been expected to shoulder. He acquired that early. He understood the nature of God, the relationship between God and man. He understood that it matters that we are created in the image of God, and not by some God who is unknowable, who occupies the entire expanse of the universe and can fit on the head of the pin at the same time. He's not some amorphous being. He's someone who looks like us as our Father, which he is, who gave his only begotten Son to come down to this earth to take upon himself the pains, the sins, the collective maladies of all mankind, while living a sinless, perfect life, so that we might overcome the twin obstacles of sin and death to return to our Maker. That was absolutely essential to his ability to communicate to us how we could live in the type of society, a type of moral, just, true, and ultimately, yes, free society, ordained and contemplated by the drafters of the Constitution. Second, his fellow man. Cleon Skousen understood his relationship with fellow beings, and that ultimately godliness consisted to a very significant degree of the ability to understand that humanity is our business, that his fellow beings and their well-being was his business, and that really was his job. Having understood both of those things, he then came to develop a better understanding of human nature. In his work at the FBI, he came into contact with a whole cast of characters, saw all sorts of things that informed him about human nature, that helped him better understand why it is that we need a Constitution and what it is that it takes in order to revere it and to protect it. He had, I imagine, some experiences similar to those that I had as a young attorney when I served as a federal prosecutor, an assistant United States attorney. We had a high-ranking official from the Department of Justice, the head of the criminal division, a guy named James Comey. I don't know whatever became of him. Despite countless other disagreements that I had with that man in subsequent iterations of my career and his, he did have something important to say when he came and spoke to us as federal prosecutors. He said, in this job, you're going to have to see some things that people shouldn't have to see, that no one would want to have to see. You see the dark underbelly of humanity. What happens when everything goes wrong in a person's family, in a person's community, in a person's life that causes them to commit just absolute heinous acts that you should not have to see but will. And so he told us, in this job, you will have to do many things, but I'm going to challenge you to love someone. Find someone or some group of people who you can love dearly and earnestly, because that will carry you through the trauma of having to see things that no human being should have to see. Undoubtedly, what horrors I saw as a federal prosecutor were just the tip of the iceberg compared to what Cleon Skousen had to see in his many trusted positions within the Federal Bureau of Investigations. But by taking on that role and experiencing those things, he understood how inextricably intertwined his love for, his understanding of God and of his fellow beings was, with understanding the nature of human beings and their capacity both for good and, unfortunately, for evil. That would be absolutely essential to this. Fourth, he came to an understanding of the law. He moved back and studied law at George Washington University, got his law degree there, and while studying there, came to develop a keen understanding of our Constitution, of the English common law. A lot of people don't think about this very often, but our entire system of government, from the structural components of the Constitution, most of them, to the laws that are adopted in most of our states, they all have their root in one way or another in the English common law. It's English. Our conception of the president is built on the pedestal of the king with some very significant, obvious, and necessary modifications. Now, Parliament is modeled, the United States Congress is modeled after the Parliament with some very significant modifications. But Cleon Skousen studied each of these components while he was in law school and undoubtedly came to an understanding of some of the truths that he would later express in the 5,000-year leap and also in the majesty of God's law, which is the divine origins of the English common law and of the British system of government, which we benefit from to this day. With that understanding, he was able to appreciate more fully the Constitution itself. Next, he understood intimately the structural components of the Constitution, which I alluded to just a moment ago. He understood that the Bill of Rights is a very important part of it. He understood also the tendency of many Americans as they speak of the Constitution to do a few things with it. Number one, to think of it as a judicial document, something that is in the custody of individuals wearing robes. Ultimately, the 9 individuals wearing robes on 2nd Street in Washington, D.C., just across the street from my office, on the Supreme Court of the United States. And he understood that this understanding is wrong, dead wrong, because it is not just a document to be employed as a tool by lawyers and as the stock in trade for jurists. No, it is a tool for every American to understand, to read, to study, to defend, to protect. It is something that every member of the United States government is already required to swear an oath of allegiance to uphold and protect and defend under Article 6. And yet you listen to most of them, and most of them speak of the Constitution in terms that are ultimately only deferential toward the court. Now, I say that not in any way in a derogatory sense toward the court. A court's there to do something important, which is to resolve disputes as to the meaning of our laws, be they statutory or constitutional, where 2 or more parties can't reach an agreement as to their meaning and where it makes a difference. Someone's been injured, someone has been wronged. The courts are the only body in our system of government that can ferret out what the law means so as to resolve that dispute. That's what they're there for. But he understood something that has been lost to many Americans, which is that most disputes, most legal questions never culminate in a lawsuit. They never make it to the court to begin with. To the extent they make it to a court, they never make it to the Supreme Court of the United States. And what that means is most constitutional questions need to be answered by ordinary, non-black robe-wearing citizens like you and me. He also understood that it's especially important for anyone serving in the United States government to have a thorough understanding of the Constitution and be willing and ready to debate it and defend it at the drop of a hat. Because if we don't have that, everything just looks back toward the courts, and the courts can't speak to every issue. He understood that feature. Next, he understood that if you think of the Constitution only in terms of the Bill of Rights, it's like the pregame show without ever entering into the football stadium. It's like if you're a Simpsons fan watching Sideshow Bob and never waiting for Krusty the Clown to show up. The main event of the Constitution is not the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is absolutely important, vital. I'm so glad that we have the freedom of speech, of press, free exercise of religion, the Second Amendment right to bear arms, the privilege of being free from unreasonable searches and seizures, compelled speech. All of the protections of the Bill of Rights are phenomenal, but they are not the main event. Those are the thou shalt nots appended onto the Constitution after other things were set in order. Necessary, yes. Helpful, yes, but they are not the main event. The main event consists of the Constitution's structural protections, which Cleon Skousen understood well and explained in terms that made them accessible to everyone, just as he did the Old Testament. Look, if you can make the Old Testament accessible as he did, making the Constitution understandable is a piece of cake. In fact, I'll just share a brief side note there. I first came into contact with his scriptural writings a few years after I'd married into Sharon's family. I was lamenting to my mother-in-law, Carol Burr. We just lost her about 3 years ago. I said, I know this is bad, but I just can't get excited about the Old Testament. I studied it in seminary. I quote it from time to time when necessary. I just don't like it. And she said, I can fix that for you. I said, that's not likely at all. She said, just give me a second. She walked in the other room. She came back with a couple of books, the first of which is The First 2,000 Years. I took that book home and I read it, hoping to prove her wrong, and I didn't. I fell in love with that book. Fell in love with it so much so that I would give her a weekly report on how it was going, and by the time I finished it, she gave me the second book, The Third 1,000 Years, and then the third book, The 4,000 Years. And I've loved the Old Testament ever since then. The story of estrangement and reconciliation. It is so apropos for all books of Scripture for the American experience. Back to the Constitution. He understood that the core of the Constitution consists of slicing and dicing power. I don't think he ever used these particular words to describe it, but he might have. It's as though we took Caesar, all-powerful Caesar, who made the laws and interpreted the laws, enforced the laws for the country, for his community, and every other community in the land. We took Caesar and we sliced him and we diced him. We set up these protections, one operating on a vertical axis. We filleted Caesar. Launch me out. This is, I'm losing the metaphor here. We'll just call it the vertical and horizontal Caesar. On the vertical axis, he split up, the Constitution split up power between the federal government and the states and localities. It's as though it was a pyramid structure, not a pyramid scheme. That's something very different. A broad, stable base at the state and local level is where most of the power of government rests. The laws that you interact with every day, the laws that tell you what happens if you go over the speed limit, if you break a contract, if you go bankrupt, if you break a contract, if you kidnap, rob, steal, murder, or something else. Most of those laws that govern our day-to-day interaction are, and should be, state laws and local laws. A few laws at the national level exist, but like the top of the pyramid, they're small. They need to be. Because our founding fathers understood that the risk of corruption inheres in any system of government. And as Cleon Skousen knew as well as anyone, it's physically impossible that James Madison could have read Doctrine and Covenants, section 121, or section 98, or section 101. And yet I think he was listening to the same God, even the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who raised up James Madison and other wise men, the greatest of their generation, the greatest of many generations, to write this document because it is God's will that men not be in captivity one to another. He put in his head a keen understanding of the fact that it's the nature and disposition of nearly all men everywhere, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, to begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. This is exactly what James Madison was talking about when in Federalist 51 he said, if men were angels, we'd have no need of government. If we had access to angels to govern us, we wouldn't need rules surrounding the operations of government. But alas, we are not angels, and we don't have access to angels to run our government, so we must have these rules. And that's why we sliced and diced Caesar. That's why it was so imperative that we put together this pyramid structure, this vertical protection, broad base, narrow at the top. The federal government would be in charge of only that which is distinctly, unavoidably, indisputably national, and national by operation of constitutional law. So those powers include, you're familiar with them, the power to declare war, to establish an army and a navy, to establish a system of regulations for what we now call national guards, immigration and naturalization laws, bankruptcy laws, postal roads and post offices, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes, and the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal, which allows you to be a pirate on the high seas. We haven't used that one in about 100 years, but we're about due, and I'm going to get one. You're all invited to join me on my pirate ship. But the point is this, that pyramid is solid. That pyramid doesn't tip over, and that pyramid doesn't leave a lot of room for corruption at the national level because there aren't that many powers. It was designed not to be a very sexy part of the government because it was small. It couldn't be manipulated as much as other governments because it didn't deal with every aspect of everyone's lives. There is no power in the Constitution, not in my copy anyway, which is the same copy he had. No power in there that gives Congress and the federal government broadly the power to make all laws that might be deemed necessary for everyone to just get along or just to benefit us generally. No, it's just the 18 clauses of Article 1, Section 8, and that's about it. If you forget everything else I say today, fine, but don't forget Article 1, Section 8. Go home and read that tonight if you can. It's really narrow, and that's it. And Cleon Skousen knew that what the founders knew, which is this is absolutely essential to make sure that government didn't become everything. Because fallen empires everywhere testified to the founding generation that democracy is dangerous. It's deadly. The founding generation feared democracy every bit as much as they feared despotism. Why? Well, because they lead to the same type of lawlessness. a lack of respect for life and liberty and property. And he knew that structure, they knew that structure would work, and Cleon Skousen knew that as well as anyone. He also understood the other structural protection of the Constitution. Remember, one vertical, the vertical one, we call it federalism. It was implicit in the original text of the Constitution, abundantly clear. As James Madison described it, this is pre-10th Amendment. In Federalist 45, that the powers granted to Congress were few and defined, and those reserved to the states were numerous and indefinite. And then in the 10th Amendment, a couple of years later, they made, 4 years later, they made explicit what was implicit in the text of the original Constitution, which is that all powers that are not granted to Congress and not prohibited by the Constitution to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, understanding that ultimately the power rests with the people. The Constitution just decides at which level they may exercise that power. That's the vertical protection. Equally important was the horizontal protection, which provides this great symmetry, if you think about it. Within our narrow federal government, we would have 3 branches, and Cleon Skousen understood as well as anyone that the most dangerous branch, the most powerful branch, the branch that could inflict the greatest amount of harm was the branch of government where I happen now to work. We know that for a couple of reasons. We know that first because it's the branch of government that's made most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. They were not going to entrust that power to just anyone. They were going to entrust it only to people who could be fired at any moment. You have the power, if you live in Utah, to fire me every 6 years. You had your shot last year, you missed. Try again in 5 years. But your representative you can fire every 2 years. And that's why, because it's a dangerous power. And we also understand it's the most dangerous branch because look at what the other 2 branches do. So the legislative branch headed by Congress, 2 houses of it, we make the laws. The other 2 branches are accoutrements. They are accessories. They're necessary accessories. That's why I get frustrated when people call them equal branches of government. They're not really equal. They're co-equal in the sense that they're not dependent on each other, but they're not really equal. Not at all. Because the other 2, look at what they do. The executive branch, headed by the president, has one job, to enforce the laws. That's what they do, or that's what they're supposed to do. Let's look at the other branch, the one that some people, much to my chagrin, frequently refer to as the most dangerous branch, but it's not. The judicial branch. It can be dangerous in its own way because it's government. Government's whole job is to break stuff and kill people. It's dangerous. That's why we need all these rules, because we're not angels. We don't have access to angels to govern us. But that other branch, headed by the Supreme Court, just interprets the laws. That's all it does. So we make the law, the president enforces them, or is supposed to, and the courts just interpret them. This is where the danger lies, is in Congress. But Cleon Skousen understood that where each branch of government operates within its lane, there's a magical symmetry that takes place. There's a magical balance, notwithstanding the fact that they operate unequally in unequal ways. They are equal in one critical respect. By the way, some people also refer to them as separate but equal branches. That makes me cringe for an entirely different set of reasons, channeling Plessy v. Ferguson, the horrible interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause, which is beyond the scope of my remarks tonight. But when you look at what the 3 branches can do to each other, they are equal in that one critical respect, in that each can check the other 2 in different ways. But in order for that check to occur, you have to make sure that they're not doing each other's jobs, and that the most dangerous of the jobs never, ever goes either to the judicial branch, whose members, once they go through the political process of being appointed and confirmed by the Senate and installed, serve in presumptive lifetime terms, or to the other branch, the executive branch, that is less accountable at less regular intervals than our members of Congress. Remember, 1/3 of the Senate can be fired every 2 years, all of the House every 2 years. President, you only get once every 4 years. He also understood you never, ever want to delegate it to the executive branch. And this understanding was gleaned from his reading of political philosophers going back hundreds of years, political philosophers including John Locke, including Baron de Montesquieu, among many others who recognize that the minute you have the same group of people who make the laws, enforcing those same laws, it's not just something that leads to tyranny, that is tyranny. Because the same group of people making the laws and enforcing the laws, when they make tyrannical laws, they will enforce them tyrannically. And you've got no other place to turn. One of the things that I'm convinced, I'm not privy to is the inner workings of his mind, like everyone else on the stand with me except me are privy to. But I would imagine one of the things that prompted him to write books like The 5,000 Year Leap is his frustration with the fact that you could say since 1913, you could say since 1933, I pinpoint it to one very specific date. But the vertical and the horizontal protections of the Constitution, which are the most important features, were set dangerously off course on one dismal date, April 12th, 1937. A date that you probably never studied in your history class, a date that even if you went to law school, you probably didn't talk about much. It's the date the Supreme Court decided a case which is itself seldom discussed among the American people. It's called the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. On that date, the Supreme Court interpreted Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, the Commerce Clause, which, remember, just gives Congress the power to regulate trade between states, with Indian tribes, and with foreign nations. They reinterpreted that to mean something else. That clause was pretty important to the Constitution. And in fact, its origins really are coextensive with the origins of the Constitution, with why it came to be. Remember, after we won the Revolutionary War, we put in place this sort of weak document. I think Cleon Skousen once described the Articles of Confederation as sort of America's experiment with quasi-anarchy or something to that effect. It just didn't work. And you had the states engaging in economic balkanization one with another. People in one state were adopting laws to punish people economically in the other states so their trade couldn't get through on favorable terms. And that's part of what brought them together in that hot, fateful, sweltering summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, to work this out so that we could have a single national economy where goods could move unobstructed from one state to another. To do that, you'd have to have one central lawmaking authority and the apparatus in place to enforce the laws that lawmaking authority adopted, and a judicial branch to interpret them. And so that's why we gave Congress this power. But the power really, from the beginning, encompassed basically two things: the power to regulate interstate commercial transactions. Russ Skousen is in Wyoming. No, he's in Idaho, and if he's growing potatoes and I buy his potatoes for my fast food chain, then that transaction can't necessarily be covered by both the laws of Utah and Idaho because they might be inconsistent, so there may be a federal law that regulates that. That's the interstate commercial transaction. The second thing that allowed Congress to regulate was channels of interstate commerce, interstate airways, airwaves, waterways, canals, roadways, bridges, etc. That's it. That's all they could regulate. But they changed that through the Supreme Court on April 12, 1937. The Supreme Court reinterpreted that clause to mean something very different. To mean that Congress could regulate any activity that, when measured in the aggregate, as long as it was economic in nature, had the potential of having a substantial economic interstate economic impact everywhere else. Yeah, what I just said is legalese, for Congress could regulate anything it wanted. If it could dream it, it could do it. It all of a sudden opened the floodgates from us being a limited purpose federal government to a general purpose national government, open-ended in scope. All of a sudden on the table for Congress was the ability to regulate labor, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, and even more pedestrian items like health, safety, and welfare. All these things were important, yes. And all of them require regulation to a degree in one form or another from time to time. But not at the federal level. The Supreme Court messed it all up. They amended the Constitution. In fact, had this been an actual amendment, well, A, it could never have been passed. You'd never have gotten the states to ratify that. You couldn't have even gotten Congress, 2/3 of Congress, to propose it. But even if you had, it would have been probably among the most 5 impactful of all 27 amendments to the Constitution. Yet we never discuss it. We don't speak of it as an amendment. We don't speak of the case or the consequences that it had. But let me tell you what it did to us. On day one, it set the seeds for inverting our well-balanced pyramid so that instead of being broad at the base, narrow at the top, we turned it upside down. It took James Madison's rubric of powers at the federal level being few and defined and numerous and indefinite at the state level, flipped it on its head. It did all that on day one. It eliminated and rendered vestigial, almost, the 10th Amendment, because if any one of the powers granted to Congress is, or to the degree that it is open-ended and limitless, the 10th Amendment means almost nothing. So Congress, all of a sudden, so we messed up the vertical protection of federalism on that one date. Almost overnight, it led to the destruction, or at least the severe deterioration, of the horizontal structural protection that we call separation of powers, because Congress, newly possessed with power over labor, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, health, safety, welfare, and a whole host of other things it had never dreamed of having the authority to touch, Congress panicked. First, because of all the work that Congress was going to have to do if it wanted to regulate all those things, and second, because of the enemies that Congress would make. Now, I think I speak with some experience here. Every time you pass a law, you might make one group of people very happy, and you will make other people very, very angry. Congress wanted to avoid that, both the work and the making people angry. And that's why Congress messed up the horizontal protection of separation of powers. It stopped, in many circumstances, passing laws and started passing platitudes, saying things like, we hereby declare that we shall have fair labor relations in the United States, and we hereby delegate to the National Labor Relations Board the power to make laws that make that so. We hereby declare that we shall have fair trade practices, and we hereby delegate to the Federal Trade Commission the power to make laws making sure that consumers are protected. It went on and on and on for decades. Decades later, Congress passed a law saying we shall have clean air. We hereby declare we shall have clean air. Now, what idiot's going to vote against that? And we hereby delegate to the EPA the power to decide what clean air is, what pollution is, what happens to polluters, how much they'll have to pay. So now, all of our, not all of them, but a lot of our laws are made outside of the legislative branch. Why does that matter? Well, it matters when we remember what James Madison said in Federalist 62. I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but it's mostly a quote. He said, "It will be of little avail to the American people that their laws be written by men of their own choosing, if those laws be so voluminous, complex, ever-changing, and unintelligible that they can't be read and understood by those subject to them, that an individual can't know from one day to the next what the law is and what it requires of him." I keep 2 stacks of documents behind my desk in Washington, a short stack and a tall stack. The short stack is usually about this tall, consists of the laws passed by Congress in the previous year. I usually look at it and think that's too long, and it is. But as long as it is completely dwarfed by the other stack. I had to have a bookcase made, 3 bookcases in fact, for that one. The other stack of documents consists of the Federal Register for the current year. Federal Register, for those of you blissfully, mercifully unaware of what it is, I'm now going to disabuse you of that bliss. It's the annual cumulative index of federal regulations. Laws that you have to obey. Laws that if you violate will result in you being fined, imprisoned, or otherwise punished. As written by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in the executive branch. And they release them in this fashion that is supposed to be faintly reminiscent of democracy, of democratic principles somehow. And Cleon Skousen, I think, here would want me to remind everyone we're not a democracy, we are a constitutional republic, and yes, it really, really matters. When they release them, they release them for notice and comment, saying, "Peasants, we, your loyal overseers, are about to adopt a new law. Tell us what you think about them, and we will pretend to care before we finalize the law. That is about how it works. A few years ago, as a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I and some of my colleagues wanted to get an overview of how many different provisions of federal law are on the books outlining crimes. In other words, how many provisions of federal criminal law are there? How many federal crimes are there on the books? We asked this question of the Congressional Research Service, and a research arm of Congress whose whole job it is to answer questions like that. They get a lot of questions from me, as you might imagine. The answer that came back was stunning. It was, dear sirs, the answer to your question is unknown and unknowable, but here's what we do know. The number stands at least 300,000. One of the reasons why it's so many is because year after year, the Federal Register I just described, this year it will reach about 100,000 pages. And they do this year after year after year. And so the reason I describe all this is channeling back to James Madison in Federalist 62. We've reached a point now where the law is so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing, we can't reasonably know and understand what the law is from one day to the next. But it's worse than Madison warned. Even worse than that. They're not even written by men and women of our own choosing. These people are exercising power historically reserved for despots. I should say tyrants, which they are. And so this matters. It matters. I first started paying attention to this closely when I was in law school, and someone estimated that federal regulations put in place by executive branch bureaucrats were costing the economy $200, $300, maybe $400 billion a year. The last time a comprehensive estimate was produced was 7 or 8 years ago. The estimate was that it was up to $2 trillion a year. I strongly suspect that that was low, and that the current accurate number is much closer to, if not well in excess of, $3 trillion a year, where it starts to rival what we spend in taxes in this country. All of this comes about just at the same moment when this government has gotten so big, doing so many things, transferring your wealth to others, that you have to work 2, 3, 4 months out of every year to pay your federal taxes, only to be told that's not nearly enough. Hasn't been enough for many, many decades because we're $33.5 trillion in debt. All of this comes about in a way that it obscures the true cost of government from the people who are made poorer by these things. And it's not big corporations that pay the cost for this. It's hardworking Americans just trying to put food on the table for their kids, who find that everything they buy is more expensive as a result of government printing too much money to pay for programs that the federal government has no business sponsoring, and are also made more expensive by this Byzantine labyrinth of federal regulations. Now I've depressed you, and I'm sorry about that. But now for the good part. The good part is that the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob occupy this land. Whether they're literal descendants or descendants by adoption, they're entitled to those blessings. And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lives. He loves us. He wants us to be free, and it's His will that we not be in bondage one to another. He's given us this formula, and He's given us an understanding of how it is that we can reclaim it, that we can restore it. We know that restoration is necessary from time to time. I've seen it throughout my life and career. It seems at every stage of my life, some building I've worked in has been going through a major overhaul. When I was in law school, the J. Reuben Clark building at BYU was undergoing a massive overhaul. So I learned contracts and torts and civil procedure and constitutional law to the sound of industrial strength drills going on through concrete and rock walls. And Capitol and the Supreme Court were both under renovation as I've worked in both of those buildings. Things sometimes tarnish that need restoration. It happened to the gospel, and the gospel was restored, and we're all beneficiaries of it. The Constitution has been tarnished, it's been damaged, and it needs restoring. I'm grateful to live in a day and age when the Constitution is in place. Remember that I'm asked quite frequently whether we've reached the point where the Constitution is hanging by a thread. I never know exactly how to answer the question. I can give the happy answer or the sad one. The happy answer goes something like this. The three branches of government still operate. We still observe at least the form of federalism and of separation of powers. But I know that's not the complete answer. I also know that the answer kind of involves some variation of the following. In any generation of time, in every generation of American history, the Constitution has, in a sense, been hanging by a thread. Because these things are not self-executing. There are no angels here, not just to run our government or to be us. There are no angels to remind us in tangible ways every single day of the constitutional principles. We have to teach each other those. There are no angels teaching in our schools, which increasingly I find don't teach the Constitution or civics at all anymore. They've replaced them with something called social studies, which I don't really understand. So there's never been a moment when the Constitution hasn't been hanging by a thread. But there have been days when it's been a heck of a lot stronger than it is right now. The good news is that we can restore it, we can strengthen it. The fact that it's hanging by a thread is itself good news if we look at it optimistically. At least it hasn't fallen yet. If there's a thread, we can add to that thread and another thread, and before long that thread will be a rope, and before long we can call it a cable. But we've got to do it. We've got to educate each other as to why this matters. It matters because we matter. Human beings matter. They matter to God, and therefore they must matter to us. This is the best system of government that the world has ever known. It was written by the hands of wise men raised up by Almighty God to that very purpose. Another man raised up by Almighty God to that very purpose was Cleon Skousen. I'm grateful to have met him, however briefly it was, and to live in a day and age when all of his works are accessible to me on a device that is never more than an arm's length from my reach. I turn to them frequently and will as long as I remain breathing. I bear you my testimony that these things are given to us by a God who loves us, who did in fact send his only begotten Son. I bear you my testimony that the church to which I belong, and I suspect most or all of you belong, is not just another church. There are many churches that teach things that are helpful and important to salvation, but this is the church through which God has restored his priesthood and the fullness of his gospel insofar as we're able to understand it. I'm so grateful that he restored his priesthood, and that priesthood remains alive and well in this church today. Cleon Skousen is truly a giant among men. May he ever be, and may we seek to learn from his wisdom, his love of God, of the gospel, of his fellow beings, and of the United States of America. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you very much. We're supposed to end at 8, but I do think we want to take a few questions, and the questions can be to Senator Lee or to myself or Joanne. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Okay.
Yes. The Constitution clearly states that the state legislatures are to set the laws for the presidential election. In 2020, there were five states that the legislatures did not set the laws. In 1876, when this happened, you know they.
We want to have just questions, okay? Okay.
The question is, what's your attitude or opinion on that? Where particularly the lawsuit by Texas.
You're absolutely right. Under the Constitution, the states are not even required to hold presidential elections. The power to allocate electors under the Constitution belongs to the state legislatures. And during the early years of the Republic, there were presidential elections in which some states didn't even hold elections. They just allocated them. The provision of the Constitution to which you were referring to, yeah, that's true, stating the obvious point that it's the legislatures that make those laws. And there were several states, as you pointed out, where modifications were made, some by judicial decree, others by executive action. Those all have to be ferreted out as a matter of state law. To one degree or another, there's always implementation that occurs. So a state itself, a state's own legislative branch and a state's own system of government generally is responsible for deciding which laws govern. And there are checks and balances there. It's not pretty. Congress doesn't have the ability to adjudicate those in between where they send only one slate of electors.
Harold in the back wanted me to mention at the end of the program tonight at the Pavilion, if anybody's interested in purchasing a copy of their Giants in the Land. So it's out in the Pavilion, okay, outside the church area. So if you're interested, and they'll be available at that point. So yes, Russ.
So Senator, I'm sure there are many things that disturb you going on in Washington, but in the spirit of Uncle Cleon's optimism, what's something good that's happening?
You know the proverbial frog that we were all taught about in young women's classes, drop the frog into the boiling pot of water, he'll jump right out. I always wanted to try this. My wife wasn't eager about the experiment. Yeah, I was afraid I was going to learn the hard way that it's not true. But if it can gradually boil to death. The good news is that the current administration, which with some help from many previous administrations, is turning up the heat so quickly that the frog's getting ready to jump. The other good news actually consists of bad news, but is in some ways good news in disguise, which is that the economic levers for doing this, our ability to print money without people noticing how much harm it causes when you do that, it's catching up to us in a way that we'll have no other choice. Winston Churchill has been quoted as saying the American people will always do the right thing after every other alternative has been explored. That's the good news.
Joel?
I have a question for Joanne.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's about three or about half a dozen statements in the book that indicate futurity. Something's going to happen in the future, which can't happen in a daily journal. They can't discuss something. Are these transitional statements?
Yes, when I say something like that would happen in the future, yes, that's where I've taken something that he wrote maybe in the 90s and I put it where it actually happened, and rather than put the date of the journal entry, I used that for a transition. So it's a good question, because how did he know something was going to happen before it happened? And so I wrote those little transitions. It's 99% his writing, but I felt like those transitions were necessary to smooth the narration and make it feel like a book that he had written. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Young man.
So, Senator, you talked about taxes and how American taxes aren't doing enough to pay for national debt. How would you suggest that we increase fiscal redistribution?
The key element, I think, is simplicity coupled with restraint. In other words, Malachi knew a thing or two about revenue collection. He understood you make it simple. You set it at 10%. Compliance is much more likely when you make it simple and relatively modest. If you're spending outside of something in that range, you're probably spending too much. If we had a government that was focused only on the powers that are actually granted to the federal government by the Constitution, it would be a lot more affordable. So simplicity, restraint.
By the way, I was going to mention one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic and the COVID, where there were all kinds of restrictions taking place. You'll notice the border was closed in Canada, between Canada and the U.S. The border was closed between Mexico and the U.S., but all 50 states, and some of them tried to impose some regulations, but because of the dormant commerce clause, which very few people know about, it's Article 9 of the Constitution. Article 10 basically says the government, states cannot restrict you from travel, from moving, from working, from sending goods and services between states. And that's the reason why you could still drive from Utah to California without being stopped, and Florida to New York and so forth. So there was some freedom that was still left in this country.
But you couldn't go to the beach.
But you couldn't go to the beach, that's true. Yes, yeah.
My question is kind of related. So I'm 30 years old. I'm raised with the love of the Constitution and like that, some topics, founding principles. I feel like people my age and younger, I'm kind of a minority. So my question is, what suggestions do you have for people our age, for practical things we can do to get people excited about and involved in things like this and
Practical advice for how to.
just to get people more interested and
Yep.
involved in defending the Constitution.
Read it, first of all. Read the constitutional text as much as you can, which from the fact that you're here and the fact you asked that question, I'm sure you have. And then read everything you can about it. Learn everything about it. Read commentaries from people you trust, like Cleon Skousen, about it. And then, here comes the fun part. Figure out a way, just like you would do with the scriptures, to liken it to your life. That's really the way we get people to understand it. Because people won't, as my wife told me when I first started running for office, when I first ran for the U.S. Senate, first time I had ever run for public office, I wanted to just talk about the Constitution. She's like, you're boring them to death. They might vote for you if only to get rid of you, but they're not going to hear anything. If you want them to actually listen to you, tell stories. And so find ways in which, in your life, in which you've been impacted either favorably by the Constitution being followed or unfavorably by the Constitution not being followed. And there will be a target-rich environment in both regards.
Okay, Austin?
Yeah, what's your strategy for fighting NSA surveillance?
I'm so glad you asked. I'm working on a bill right now that I'm going to try to release in the next few weeks to just the latest iteration. We've had other iterations of reforms to get rid of government spying on its own citizens. I was the lead Senate sponsor of what became the USA Freedom Act that ended the bulk metadata collection. In other words, until, 2015, the government was monitoring who called you, when you talked, how long you talked, and they could pick up a surprisingly large volume of information just on those things before even listening to your calls. We've got a real opportunity at the end of this year, December 31st at midnight. Something called Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is set to expire. The people at the CIA and the NSA and all the other three-lettered agencies out there are fretting over this. Now, there are some things about Section 702 is designed to allow us to monitor things that people are saying mostly overseas about the United States. It's a good thing to have. People outside the United States who are not U.S. citizens don't have the same rights and protections that we have. The Constitution's worried about protecting us, not them, so that's fine. Problem is the way it was written, the way it's been implemented, they sometimes do a little oopsie here or there. And a little oopsie, I mean, they record a lot of your phone conversations, store them at the point of the mountain, and then some FBI agents can decide, I don't like Russ, so I'm going to do a search on Russ. I don't know if they've actually done that on you, Russ, but I'll make sure they don't. So I've got a Democratic colleague with whom I'm working to overhaul this thing. It's got to be reauthorized, but it needs to have its wings clipped in a bunch of serious ways. We're going to be coming out with that in a few weeks. That has to be done statutorily.
Well, I should mention that you mentioned storytelling. Cleon actually says, how did I develop this formula for success in the first 2,000 years and so forth? and storytelling was the secret. And he actually probably holds a Guinness Book of World Records of having at one point 425 people in his gospel doctrine class in Southern California. That's how successful he was. Really pretty amazing. So I noticed Joe Cannon is here in the audience. Do you have a question? You don't? Huh?
Where?
Joe Cannon, right there. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We were friends. I knew Joe before I knew Mark.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Roe v. Wade was reversed a few years back, we all know. Why in 86 years has this Commerce
year.
Clause thing with the Supreme Court never been challenged?
It's a great question. Why has NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel never been challenged the same way that Roe versus Wade was challenged for a long time? Abortion was something people could understand. I first learned about Roe versus Wade when I was about 10 years old, and by the way, I think it was the happiest my dad was a happy person, but it may have been the happiest expression I ever saw on his face when he explained it to me when I was 10, and I said, well, it seems wrong to me. He said, why? And I said, well, it's legislative in nature. That's not really a judicial determination, so it's the wrong branch, but it's also not federal. Anyway, he liked that. It's easy for a 10-year-old to understand abortion. You're killing a baby. And it's much harder for a 10-year-old or for most 40, 50, 60-year-olds to grasp on why they should be upset that the Commerce Clause power of Congress should extend beyond channels and instrumentalities in interstate commercial transactions. It takes more legwork getting up to it.
Well, your example was very good, turning that triangle upside down.
Yeah, I like that one. I like that one. We came really close a few years ago. I think in NFIB versus Sebelius, we had a real opportunity. I wish the Supreme Court had done it then. But I will say this, we have never in the history of the Republic, certainly never in the history of the post-1937 Republic, had a Supreme Court better staffed and better equipped to deal with things like this. I hope that litigants will start making this argument before the Democrats come in and pack the Supreme Court and ruin the whole thing all over again, because I think this might be a good time to start whittling back on that.
Hey, Senator, on this page there of the Supreme Court, would you be able to reason maybe, because I don't know, the decision for the abortion, right, that the Supreme Court did recently, and allowing the states to be sort of sovereign and be able to determine the abortion rules and laws in one state. For me, I see this as a divine providence from God. And as you mentioned before, you know, everything that Cleon did, he was called by God. One thing that I've learned.
What is your question?
So that's the question. Is if what is like the possibility that we can really do something in our state to be able to use the Supreme Court, although it is inverted right now, but God should be showing us that we should act right now to keep what we have done, to keep abortion out from the state of Utah. Do you think it's possible, or what do you think would happen if we were to really focus on that right now?
Well, fortunately, Utah and every other state is now focusing on this issue. It was taken off the table for better part of 50 years. They couldn't do anything. And all of a sudden, Dobbs comes along, and the lefties are freaking out about it, saying that it's the end of democracy, which is quite the opposite of what they mean, because you took it away from unelected, unaccountable jurists, and you put it back in the hands of elected lawmakers again. So Utah is going to make a different choice there than Vermont or Massachusetts or California, and thank heaven above that it does. But that's the whole point. And there is now a rekindled debate among Congress. Republicans are becoming a problem on this now. Because, see, the Supreme Court has now recognized this is not a federal issue, unless you're dealing with it in D.C. or on an Indian reservation, a federal installation, or while traveling across state lines or something like that. Abortion is not a federal issue anymore. A lot of my Republican colleagues, slouching towards Gomorrah, or like the dog turning to his vomit, are still unwilling to let go of this as a federal issue. I have a colleague named Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Love the man, great man. He's like your prize sharpshooter who sometimes shoots his own men, but he's a good guy. He really wants to protect life, and so he's running this bill. The abortion shall be illegal everywhere in the United States after the 15th week. Not a bad thing to go after nationally, if you could do that, fewer abortions. But it's got a bunch of problems. Namely, it's not constitutional. We don't have that authority. And so we've got to follow federalism, whether we perceive that it's going to scratch the itch that we want or not. We have to stick with it because it's the only way it works. And incidentally, by keeping it at the state level, we'll save more babies that way too.
Well, I hope you're right. It is interesting. A lot of you may not know this. I don't know if you know this or not. But since 1980, after Roe v. Wade, the number of abortions in America was in a secular decline. Since Roe v. Wade was reversed, it's gone up.
After Dobbs.
It's a strange situation. Sharon.
I would like to ask Senator Lee, how is the Senate feeling, and especially how are you feeling about what's going on with Hamas and Israel?
That's right. I did promise that you would talk about the Middle East a little bit. Great. Quick response.
Okay.
This will be the last question.
Few issues have united Republicans and Democrats for decades, quite like Israel has. It's been a pretty bipartisan issue. Culturally, religiously, and otherwise in America, we feel a kinship with Israel. Before we even get to the fact that we played a pretty key part in the creation of the modern nation state of Israel. And so for that many reasons, and for the fact that we have most of the same enemies, we view ourselves appropriately as being sort of in the same lifeboat. This has been something that's brought Republicans and Democrats together for a long time, and so instinctively, you've got a Congress that still, on a bipartisan basis, wants to defend Israel, and at least defend Israel's right to protect herself. It started to fray in the last few years, and I don't really understand it. It started to fray in weird ways. You started to see it maybe in 2015 with the discussions around the JCPOA, the so-called Iran agreement. And you've got some built-up hostility, the composition sometimes known as, gosh, I hope I'm not struck down by lightning. I'm getting a little partisan here, but it's a partisan question, so I have to answer it. So, the Squad hates Israel, and the Squad's approach to Israel is starting to metastasize within one of the parties. I'm not going to tell you which, because we're in a church. I'll tell you which animal symbolizes. No, never mind. We're instinctively wanting to at least defend Israel's right to defend herself, and we've got a long-standing quasi-contractual obligation to replenish things like the Iron Dome and the Iron, what do we call this? The laser. It's like this Buck Rogers version of Iron Dome. So we're going to be helping them with some of their weapons stuff. There's no question about that. But it opens up all kinds of questions, though, as to how far it'll go and whether we're also going to feed the other end of this. See, our government has been feeding the other end of this conflict, meaning giving money to Hamas. It's always disguised and it's filtered through other things. So, oh no, we're not giving money to Hamas. We're just giving money to people who give it to other people who give it to Hamas. I mean, we've got some sense of self-respect and decency, but we've given a lot of money to Hamas. And the impulse, we had a classified briefing the other day, the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Deputy Secretary of State. Secretary of State was out of the country at the time, came and briefed us. And obviously I'm not going to go into the classified stuff that they talked to us about, but the non-classified stuff that they talked to us about was peppered with objections by a lot of people of one party, not going to tell you which one, saying, yeah, but when are we going to give aid to no, they didn't say Hamas, to the other side, to the Palestinians in Gaza. The problem is you cannot give aid to to the Palestinians in Gaza without aiding Hamas. They're inextricably intertwined. I mean, it's like saying, we're not going to give stuff to Latter-day Saints, we're just going to give it to people who live in Utah County and go to church in buildings that have basketball courts. You know? It doesn't work. And so, but it's going to create this weird dynamic in which we're, I expressed it this way in a tweet the other day. My staff and my family hate it when I tweet while on an airplane because something about the elevation and the low oxygen concentration just makes me want to say things by tweet. But I said it's as though we've got a president who bought a humidifier and a dehumidifier, and he locked them in a room just so they could fight it out with each other. He's been feeding Hamas and feeding Israel, and you can't really do both. And so this sort of thing can quickly escalate into a regional and then a global conflict if we're not careful. This is one of the many reasons why Cleon Skousen was right, among other things, in cautioning us, much like our first president, George Washington, against entangling alliances. The more we get enmeshed in other people's wars, fighting other wars by proxy, the worse off we're going to be. The good news here is Israel doesn't even need us to fight this war. We help them develop weapon systems because they're to our mutual benefit, and we will replenish some of those. But they don't need us. They're not asking us to fight this war. All they're asking is that we defend them and we continue with our part of the obligation on those weapons, and that's it. But that is going to prove to be too much for some of my colleagues of one particular party, which I will not identify here. At the end of the day, you've got one group of people down there. It is heartbreaking, and I've been over there, and I know that, like so many other things, it's a lot more complicated than people want to make it. But at least in Gaza, Hamas is impossible to extricate from Palestinians in Gaza. You just can't do it. And Hamas is not willing to recognize the right of Jewish people to live in the Holy Land. It's not willing to recognize their right to exist. Israel is willing to recognize the Palestinians' right to exist, but it doesn't go the other way. And that's what makes this so heart-wrenching and ultimately so biblical and ultimately potentially apocalyptic.
So as Jamie's coming up to give the closing prayer, I want to end with probably one of the most optimistic statements that my Uncle Cleon made, and we have it quoted at the end of the book. He was asked one time, given all the terrible things that are happening in the world, and made a list of all of these things, how can you remain optimistic? To which he replied, well, brothers and sisters, I read the book, and in the book, we win.